The Cowboy family laughed when he bought a rusted iron safe. But what he built left them speechless. The summer auction brought out the whole town. Dust swirled beneath worn boots and bonnets as the auctioneer's voice rang loud across the main street. Wagons creaked, chickens clucked, and the sun baked the wooden boards of the platform where unwanted goods waited to be sold. Among the rusted tools, chipped lanterns, and sagging furniture stood a strange object that caught no one's eye but hers. A rusted iron safe, its hinges fused shut, its paint flaking like dry skin. Beside it stood Clara Monroe, hands folded tightly, eyes pinned to the ground. Her dress was clean but plain, her presence unwelcome. Two girls in bonnets giggled as they passed her. A woman whispered behind a lace fan. "She's here again. Still thinks she belongs," someone murmured. "She should have stayed gone after what happened," said another. Clara stood still, jaw set. A tall man in a crisp hat nudged his wife, nodding toward her. "Poor thing. Can't even look people in the eye. You know what they say about her." A laugh broke from the small crowd as the auctioneer gestured to the safe. "Old iron box. No key, no clue what's inside. Might be gold, might be rat bones. Who'll take a chance?" The crowd chuckled again. Then a voice cut through. "I'll take it." Heads turned. At the back of the crowd stood a quiet cowboy in worn denim and dusty boots, arms crossed. "The man's buying junk now," someone scoffed. "It's not worth $1, said another. But he walked forward anyway, laid the coin down, and nodded once. Clara blinked. For the first time in a long while, someone didn't laugh. He just bought the thing everyone else had thrown away. Clara Monroe had once been the teacher in Hilford's only schoolhouse. Her voice had filled the chalk-dusted air with poetry and patience. Children had carried wildflower to her desk. She had been proud then. She had belonged. That ended the night her husband vanished with the town's church funds. He had taken every penny entrusted to him and left her nothing but a locked door and a name no longer safe to wear. The townsfolk did not speak his name anymore. They whispered hers. She did not leave, though they expected her to. She stayed in a room above the cooper's shop, trading bookkeeping for rent, her lessons exchanged for silence. Her hair lost its shine, her hands grew calloused, her name became a stain instead of a story. Women crossed the street when they saw her coming. Men looked through her like glass. Children, once fond, now watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. But she walked straight-backed through it all. Every morning she swept her porch. Every evening she lit her lantern. The shame wrapped around her like a second skin, but she wore it with quiet defiance. She had no family left. Her father had passed 2 winters ago. Her mother had died long before that. There were no cousins nearby, no sisters to write. Just Clara, alone in a town that believed she should have disappeared with her husband. Still, she endured. At night, she read borrowed books and stitched her worn hem. She spoke softly to the birds on the sill. She saved pennies in a jar, though she had no real plan for them. Her life was measured in routine, in control, in the dignity of not asking for pity. And yet, deep inside, something small ached to be seen, not as a widow, not as a fool, not as a shadow of disgrace, but as someone still alive. So when the cowboy placed his coin on that table and took the rusted safe without flinching, Clara's chest stirred with something unfamiliar. Not hope, not yet, but something close enough to make her look again. His name was Eli Ward. He was not the kind of man who spoke unless he had something to say. Folks called him Q. You ate but not cold. He ran cattle on the outskirts of Hilford, where the land sloped down toward the dry riverbed and the winds carried dust instead of water. His house was made of hand-cut timber and long silences. He built it himself after his father passed. Eli came into town once a week for supplies, never more. He tipped his hat to shopkeepers, nodded at children, and kept mostly to himself. The Ward family name was old and respected. His brothers talked too loud and drank too much. Eli didn't join in. He stayed still, listened, and went home. but he had seen Clara long before the auction. He'd noticed how she walked, shoulders stiff, eyes downward, never asking for kindness. He had seen her early mornings at the well, drawing water alone. At church, she sat near the back, near the door, ready to leave before the final hymn. He saw how people turned from her, and how she never turned back. He never joined the whispers, never smiled at the jokes, and when he saw the iron safe placed beside her at the auction, something in him moved. It wasn't about the safe. He saw what others didn't, that she was still standing, that even with the weight of shame pressed against her, she hadn't buckled. She hadn't run. That mattered to him. When he placed the coin on the table, he didn't look at the rusted box. He looked at her, just for a moment. She didn't meet his gaze, but she felt it. Later, when the safe rattled in the back of his wagon, his brothers jeered over supper. "Hope that thing ain't cursed," laughed Nathan. "Bet it's full of snakes," said Joel. Eli only shrugged. "Then I'll find a way to deal with them." He said no more. But that night, under the glow of a single oil lamp, he brushed the dust from the iron door and stared at its silent lock. Not every box stayed closed forever, and not every person stayed forgotten. 2 days after the auction, Clara found a small note tucked beneath her door. "I could use someone with careful hands, ledger work, weekly pay, if you're willing. E.W." She read it twice. The initials struck her. Eli Ward. She hadn't spoken a word to him before, but now he was offering her work. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the note and set it on the table. She didn't rush to reply. She waited a day, maybe to test her own courage, maybe to steady her heart. When she arrived at his ranch, the fields were quiet, save for the soft mooing of cattle and the rhythmic thud of a hammer in the barn. Eli met her at the porch, nodded once, and opened the door without ceremony. The house was sparse but clean. A desk waited near the window, papers stacked neatly, an abacus lay on the corner. He didn't offer explanations or pleasantries, just pointed toward the chair and said, "This is where I get lost. You look like someone who wouldn't." That was all. She came the next day, and the day after. Each morning, she'd walk the 2 miles in silence, carrying her small satchel. Each evening, she'd return with a little more air in her lungs. One morning, she reached for the ledger and found a pair of soft brown gloves folded neatly beside it. "They're not new," Eli said from the doorway, "but they're warm. Saw you rubbing your hands yesterday." Clara didn't speak. She only nodded, slipped them on, and turned back to the desk. That afternoon, she left a small bundle on the counter, her mother's old bread recipe, written in careful script. Eli found it that evening and baked it the next morning. The bread was misshapen, dense, slightly burned at the edges. Still, Clara smiled when he handed her a piece, and he smiled back, a rare, quiet curve of his lips. No words passed between them about what was building, but the silence between them began to feel less empty. Respect settled there first, not romance, not yet. Just two people, recognizing something familiar in the quiet. The days at Eli's ranch began to stretch longer. Clara's job at first had been the ledgers, tallying expenses, tracking feed orders, marking down cattle sales, but soon she found herself drawn into more. She tried helping in the kitchen. Her cornbread burned. She mixed up sugar for salt once, and Eli, without a word, chewed the salty biscuits and nodded as if they were fine. Then she tried mending one of his worn shirts. Her stitching was crooked, fingers too stiff from years away from the needle. When he found the shirt folded on his bed, uneven threads clear as daylight, he wore it the next morning anyway. He never pointed out her mistakes, never corrected her with a sigh or a look. When she spilled the ink bottle across 2 days' worth of entries, she apologized 3 times, voice tight with embarrassment. He only fetched a fresh book, set it before her and said, "Let's start again." Clara wanted to do better, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper that was beginning to grow quietly inside her. Once she tried carrying a sack of grain from the barn. It was too heavy. She slipped, and the whole thing burst open, seeds spilling like rain over the dirt. She sat there, staring at the mess, dust on her face, the ache in her knees, sharp and humiliating. Eli knelt beside her. He didn't scold, didn't chuckle. He reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then he started scooping the grain back into the bag, one handful at a time. She helped. Neither of them said a word, but something passed between them then, something solid, like the way the earth feels steady underfoot after a storm. That evening she found a small box on the ledger table. Inside was a pen, smooth, weighty, the kind used for signatures, not scribbles. A folded paper beneath it read, "For the one who keeps my numbers honest." The next morning she brought him a jar of jam she had made from wild berries. He didn't say it was delicious. He just took a spoonful, closed the jar, and kept it beside his coffee. Each act was simple, small, but the air between them had shifted. He never pried into her past. She never asked about his. But when she laughed at one of his dry remarks, and he looked over with that slow nod of his, it felt like they were building something quiet and firm. Not love yet, but the shape of it. No declarations. Just a rhythm forming between them. A way of being that made her less afraid to stay a little longer, and him a little less used to being alone. One late afternoon, Clara was shelling peas on the porch when Eli's neighbor, Ruthie Harper, rode up with her young son in tow. The boy, no more than 5, had dirt on his cheeks and a curious spark in his eye. "Eli," Ruthie called out, "I need to ride to the doctor in town. Jake's got a cough I want looked at. Can Sammy stay a bit?" Eli nodded. Of course. Clara watched as the little boy ran up the porch steps and plopped himself beside her, his small boots kicking the wood. "What you doing?" he asked. "Getting peas ready for supper," she replied softly. He watched for a while, then asked, "Can I help, Mama?" The word fell out of his mouth so naturally, like it belonged there. Clara's hands froze. "Mama?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The boy looked up with bright eyes. "You smell like biscuits. Mama used to smell like that." Clara felt her breath catch. She turned her face slightly so he wouldn't see the tears welling. Eli stepped onto the porch just then, holding 2 glasses of water. He paused, seeing her shoulders tremble ever so slightly, the boy leaning against her knee, still chattering. She wiped her face quickly and forced a smile, placing a pea pod into the boy's tiny hands. "You can help," she said, voice steady now, "but only if you're good at it." The boy grinned, proud. Eli didn't say a word. He simply sat nearby and handed them both a cool drink. Later, after Ruthie returned and the boy had waved goodbye, Clara remained seated long after the sun dipped below the hills. Something had shifted, not broken, but mended. She had not been called Mama in mockery or pity or confusion. She had been seen by a child, and not as ruined or shameful, but as warm, safe, familiar. That night, she lit the lantern with a steadier hand, and when she closed the door, her smile lingered longer than the light. The town square was lively that Saturday morning. A traveling merchant had set up a colorful stall selling lace, ribbons and trinkets, drawing curious eyes and busy hands. Clara stood by the fabric table comparing 2 pieces of blue cotton. She had begun sewing again, small aprons and mended shirts for the ranch, nothing grand, but it felt good to create with her hands. Then a voice cut through the soft chatter, sharp as a knife. "Well, look who's out pretending to belong." Clara froze. That voice. She hadn't heard it in over a year. She turned slowly. There he was, Thomas Green, her husband's old friend, the man who used to visit their home often, sharing whispers and coin pouches with her husband when he thought she wasn't listening. He was part of the scheme, she had always suspected. But he had disappeared too, right before the money did. And now he stood just feet away, with a cruel smile and breath that reeked of whiskey. "Didn't think you'd show your face here again," he said, loud enough for nearby shoppers to pause. "I never left," Clara answered, her voice low but clear. He stepped closer, voice rising. "Maybe you should have. People still remember. Shame sticks, you know. Doesn't wash out with time." A few townsfolk looked away. A few watched. Clara clenched her hands, not in fear, but something else. Resolve. "She had nothing to do with what happened," came a voice behind her. Eli stepped forward, eyes steady, jaw firm. He stood beside her, not in front, not shielding, equal. "She's paid more than her share," he added, calm but final. Thomas laughed, but it rang hollow. "Oh, so now the silent rancher plays hero?" "No," Clara said, louder now. "He's just the first man who's seen me for who I really am." Her voice didn't shake. It rang across the square, clean and proud. Thomas took a step back. The smirk faded. Clara looked at the crowd. "I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I've worked for every bite I eat, every stitch I wear, and I won't bow to ghosts anymore." The silence was thick, but it held something new. Respect. Thomas muttered something under his breath and turned away, disappearing into the alley like smoke. Eli looked at her. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, breath catching. "I think, for the first time, I am." And in that stillness, standing side by side, Clara no longer felt like a woman surviving her past. She felt like someone rewriting it. The storm rolled in fast, sweeping across the plains with wind that howled like a wounded thing. Eli was mending a fence post near the ridge, and Clara had gone to the edge of the pasture to collect tools left behind. Neither saw the sky darken until the rain broke like a hammer. A sharp cry cut through the wind. Clara turned. It was Sammy, Ruthie's boy, clutching the neck of a startled horse, the reins dragging. The horse had spooked and bolted from the neighbor's corral. The child had tried to stop it, but now he clung to its mane as it galloped wild toward the ravine at the far edge of the land. Clara didn't think. She dropped the tools and ran, mud soaking her skirts, hair whipped across her face. She could barely see, but she chased the blur of hooves and boy, heart pounding louder than the thunder. "Sammy!" she screamed. "Let go!" But he was frozen, terrified. Just as the ravine came into view, Clara lunged forward, arms outstretched. She managed to catch the trailing reins and yank them hard. The horse reared back, nearly knocking her over, and Sammy slid from the saddle into her arms. She clutched him tight, shielding his body with hers as the storm lashed around them. Footsteps thundered behind her. Eli arrived, drenched, eyes wild. He dropped to his knees, pulling them both into his arms without a word. His hands trembled as he checked Sammy's face, then Clara's. "You," he breathed, voice breaking. "You ran into that." "I couldn't let him fall," she said softly, still holding the boy. He looked at her differently then, not with surprise, but with something deeper, admiration, trust. Later, when the storm passed and the three of them stood in silence under the grey sky, the bond between them was no longer quiet. It was earned, not just through kindness or work, but through courage, through loyalty, through love that was no longer unspoken. The following Sunday, the church pews were fuller than usual. Rain had softened the roads, and the scent of wet earth drifted through the open windows. Clara walked in quietly, as she always had, but this time heads turned for a different reason. Mrs. Talbot, who once whispered behind fans, gave a gentle nod as Clara passed. Mr. Greenwell, the storekeeper, tipped his hat with something close to shame in his eyes. A few children waved. One even smiled. Clara took her usual seat near the back. But just before the hymn began, Ruthie Harper rose and gestured toward the front pew beside her. Clara hesitated, then stood. The walk down that aisle felt longer than it was, but not heavy, not anymore. As she sat, a murmur swept through the room, not of mockery, but recognition. After the service, Eli waited outside, his hat in hand. Sammy stood beside him, tugging at Clara's skirt. "Will you come over tonight?" the boy asked. "Mama says you make better jam than her." Clara chuckled softly, heart full. That evening, as she passed the bakery, she overheard a voice from the porch. "She's got strength, that one." Another replied, "Not many would have stayed. She faced it all head on." Clara didn't stop walking. She didn't need to. The town hadn't changed overnight, but something had shifted. She was no longer a whisper. She was a name spoken with quiet respect. The shame that once clung to her dress had loosened its grip. Dignity, long buried, had risen again, not because she demanded it, but because she lived it. And now, Hilford saw her not as the woman who had been left behind, but the woman who had never left. The sun was low when Clara finished closing the ledger for the day. The house was quiet, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. Eli stood by the workbench near the window, sanding something small and careful in his hands. She wiped her ink-stained fingers and turned to leave, but he spoke, voice low. "Stay a minute?" She paused, then nodded. He walked over slowly and handed her a small wooden box, smooth, carved with gentle curves. It fit perfectly in her palm. "I made it from the cedar by the barn," he said. "Took a while." Clara opened the lid. Inside, nestled in flannel, was a key. It wasn't for a door. It was for the rusted iron safe. She looked up, confused. "I've been working on it," Eli said. "Every night after supper. Took some time, but I finally figured out the lock." She blinked. "You never said." He shrugged. "Didn't want to open it without you." They stood in silence. Then slowly he added, "Clara, I don't know what you want for your life. Maybe it's not here. Maybe it's not me. But if you want this land, this house, the work, the quiet mornings, I'd like to share it with you." He looked at her, not pleading, not demanding. "Not because you owe me anything, but because it feels less like home without you in it." Clara closed the lid of the box, fingers tracing the grain. She stepped closer, so near he could hear her breath. "I want it," she whispered. "Even the hard parts?" he asked. She smiled. "Especially the hard parts." And in that soft, firelit room, without rings or promises or grand speeches, a life began, not loud, not hurried, but real and rooted, and quietly forever. In the quiet corners of Hilford, folks still talk about the cowboy who bought a rusted iron safe, not because of what was inside, but because of what he built around it. They say the safe held nothing but old receipts and a faded family photograph, forgotten by time. But what truly mattered was the woman who helped him open it, and the life that grew from everything others had tossed away. Clara never asked for honor. She earned it in silence, through stitched,